Morning, everybody. Morning, Artemis. Thank you very much for that introduction. I think, as Artemis mentioned this morning, it's going to be hopefully it's going to be quite interactive. So I think as a start, quite topical is the JIBAR ZARONIA change or switch that's happening or that's due to happen by the end of next year. And I thought when engaging with Artemis, we look at something just to give some comfort to the market in terms of this rate switch. And I know it presents quite a unique and distinct challenges to the South African bond market, more so than I would think from the loan market perspective, because we've got bilateral loans and it's much easier to negotiate those by way of addendums and changes to those agreements, where on the bond side, again, we've got multiple pricing supplements out in the market, or predominantly pricing supplements, I think lesser offering circulars. And in order to change this, we would deal with an open market, which makes it much more complicated. So I think for today's discussion, what I want to do is not to go into the detail on how to amend your programs or what to insert where in the documentation, but just to give you an overall view of the various options or approaches that can be followed by issuers in the debt capital markets. From an investor perspective, we can also look at some questions around that if there are questions around the implementation of these various options. So just from a high level, we'll discuss quickly on the ZARONIA timeline that we will look at. We will then also consider the various options, and then we would look at what issuers can do now and what they could do at a later stage and what the market is looking at this point in time, because I think it's quite fluid at this stage in terms of what's happening. I think as a start, I was expecting a flurry of, or the floodgates opening and everyone trying to change their programs and have them ready. And it seems that there's a bit of a lag there and that the market is slowing down in terms of that. But let's just start at the beginning. I think you've seen this timeline many times on various other presentations on the loan market, or whether it was for hedging. But I think key from this perspective, I'm not going to go through the foundation, the adoption, because all of that's in the past, but rather just focus on three key dates for us here, which is the transition phase that we're in. We're now nearing the end of December 2025, or the end of the year. And I think let's start at that. And I think it's on the right of the screen, that lighter blue or color there on the right. What's a light blue, but on the right. So if we just look at the timelines there, the first timeline, or the timeline that's coming up at this stage, is the announcement of the cessation date. I think that's everyone's waiting for that in anticipation, because I think these dates, if we look at the options that are available, plays a significant role in terms of when you do pull the trigger in terms of which option you may decide to go for. So I think the cessation date of December 2025 is quite important, the announcement there. So we're all waiting for that. The cessation of the JIBAR rate is earmarked for the end of December 2026. So there's about a year from now that would happen. Then I think there's also a key date in between, which is the March 2025 date, where the Reserve Bank has issued or requested that no new JIBAR rated notes may be issued following that particular date. So I think we'll talk about how do we manage around that if you have not decided to update your program or to provide for the benchmark replacement language. But we'll come back to that a bit later on. And then I think there's another date that's not in here, is the date of the announcement or the tough legacy legislation, the effective date of that coming to force, not in force, but once, getting it through Parliament, which is earmarked for October, November 2026. So 4 dates to think about: announcement date of the cessation date, December, the cessation date, the end of December 2026, and then the date that stops, or that where the request is that no JIBAR rated notes can be issued. So at this stage, there's no current obligation, or the current position, there's no current obligation on anyone to do anything. Hence the reason we haven't seen quite a lot of these coming through the market. JIBAR remains effective until the official cessation date. We all know that, and the cessation date for that is December 2026. And there's no obligation currently to issue ZARONIA linked notes. Now, we've seen at this stage, just quickly on that, there are a couple of issues, one or two issues in the market, especially the banks, that have issued ZARONIA rated notes. We also understand from having discussed that, excuse me, with them, that there were some struggles around that process. And I think that's also one of the reasons why the market's holding back, to see what is happening in that space. I think the key thing there would be the systems issues, both from an issue perspective that needs to be aligned, as well as that from an investor perspective, so that there's a smooth transition when you do decide to do a switch over on that. So we then move on to the next slide, which will be the key concepts which we'll deal with. I think all of these you've seen before, the credit spread adjustment, or the that will happen. We know about the tough legacy contracts. We'll talk about that quickly, and safe harbor legislation, which will come a bit later on. In terms of the credit adjustment spread, or the CAS, we all know that we need that for purposes of adding that to our ZARONIA, so that that can equal to the JIBAR rate. And again, this has been discussed at length in the market, and everyone knows it. And I think everyone has some form of representation on the MPG committee with the Reserve Bank in this space. So not too much to say around that particular point. Then if we move on to the next slide, which is the tough legacy contracts. Now, we all know that there are quite a number of tough legacy contracts there without any means or wording into it that talks about benchmark replacement or JIBAR replacement language in it. Now, you'll remember from the beginning, or when the JIBAR was, when this whole ZARONIA issue was announced on the foundation phase, as we looked at from a timeline perspective, people tried to preempt that by introducing some of the older programs JIBAR replacement language, which then generally just catered for the switch over if the rate ceases to exist at a later stage. But it was loosely drafted based on what we have seen and what came via the loan market documentation, which was equally applied or adjusted for purposes of the bond market. But again, for other contracts, for the majority of the programs in South Africa, we don't have any JIBAR or ZARONIA replacement language, or anything that contemplates the ZARONIA replacement that may happen at a later stage. So we are stuck with these tough legacy contracts. For example, bonds. We're not going to deal with bilateral syndicated loans, but we're all aware of that. Derivatives is out there, and some other contracts that are existing in the market that does or that do make reference to JIBAR. Now, the plans for this is that there need to be some form of engagement. Now, we've seen the engagement happening in this market at this stage to date, following the discussions that, from the Reserve Bank, MPG, and we've seen how that unfolded, from first focusing on derivatives, then loan market, then lastly on the bond market, if you look at the various interactions that we had with the Reserve Bank on that. So I think going forward, again, there will be, for the first few switchovers, which I think will happen in due course, there will be some interaction with investors as well in terms of ensuring a smooth transition on that. Now, if one look at the transition mechanics or mechanisms that's available, what we will do is, if we move on to the next slide, is that there are three options available to the market at this stage. We've seen this, we've debated them. I think we've basically followed quite a bit what was happening in the UK and what was happening in the United States in terms of options available, as we generally do, to just follow those sort of legislative direction that was followed there. What I'm going to do today is to talk about option one, which would be the active transition. And then there will be option two, the benchmark replacement, and then also tough legacy or legislation. Before we move over to the next slide, let's just stand still quickly on those. These three options are available. It all depends on the circumstances, which we'll deal with a bit later on. But I think if we just look at option one and option two briefly, they're proactive in the sense where option three, of course, is the tough legacy legislation that will be promulgated by Parliament in terms of making it mandatory that all JIBAR rated notes will stop or cease to exist, and that ZARONIA rated notes will then will take over from that particular point. So if we then go on to the first option, active transition. So what my plan here is today is basically just to set out the scene in terms of what it requires, and then basically going into what is the steps that one needs to take or consider for purposes of implementing the various options in this process. We will, of course, then also just go through a very quick documentation, step-by-step slide just to deal with the process that's involved so that everyone's just aware of that. And then at the end, we will then just stand still quickly on what you need to do from an issuer perspective. The first option, as I said, active transition. It's an immediate change, very proactive at this point in time. Basically, it's spot welding, because you would look at the amendment of your pricing supplements. It's not going to be a program amendment. So I think quite important here is first of all, before anyone embarks on a switch over, wants to switch over to ZARONIA, whether it's doing a ZARONIA rated note now off your existing program, or whether you want to do a JIBAR replacement at a later stage, you need to ensure that your systems are ZARONIA compliant. We understand, as I mentioned earlier, that there were some hiccups on previous ZARONIA rated notes. But again, yeah, I think one will always have to ensure that can work from that perspective, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to have both sides from an issuer perspective and an investor perspective to patch in to that new system for that. And I know that there are a lot of issuers at this stage that are looking at this to ensure that their systems are aligned. We have seen some of the international programs where they have, or local programs with offshore parent guarantees, that they do look at what was happening from an offshore perspective to bring that into their systems, to align the systems to ensure that they would work. But again, it will be South African based, and there will be South African challenges in that regard. Now, if we look at the amendment that's required under active transition, it's an issuance at issuance level. As I said early on, it seeks the consent of bondholders to amend the reference rates, switching from JIBAR to ZARONIA. So it's a very specific issuance level thing. And if we do speak about issuance, then it's your pricing supplement. There's no surgery to your program that you make. It's really just fixing that issue in your pricing supplement. Basically, for that, now if it's proactive, I'm not talking about later down with tough legacy legislation, we would need a corporate action from both, if it's a listed note or unlisted note, through the straight system, or both is listed through straight and the JSE, so that written consent, or you'll have to look at the provisions in your program. But what's quite important here is just to stand still and to look at your amendment provisions to clearly determine whether those caters for meetings of note holders, or does it cater for consent and meeting of note holders. So older programs, or the very old programs, they still talk about meetings, so then you'll have to follow corporate action by a meeting of note holders. If it's written consent, much easier to do that and less time consuming, you don't have to attend meeting, then I would rather recommend a written consent process. Again, very important here to get this amendment done, because it's a material change to the terms and conditions. You would need to look at your percentages for the voting percentages that's required, whether it's 66.67%. Older program, or very older programs, may still have 75% of them. If you have a program which is a structured note or a secured note, always look at your restrictive matters, which I assume this will be a restricted matter, and that may require a much higher threshold than 66.67%. This is a requirement, that's an amendment this amendment, it's at issue level. As I said, it means that for each pricing supplement in the market, you will have to get the consent. So it's going to be an issue by issue basis consent that's required, not at program level, again, as I reiterated. Again, the JSE will be involved in terms of this process. You will need to reach out to the JSE and obtain the consent from the JSE before, emphasis on before, you embark on a process with your engagement with investors to get this through the system. So it's quite important to do that. You can't just issue your notice, because it's a requirement under listing on the DSSs. Again, the notification process would happen via JSE, via SENS announcement, and also straight notification, so that the relevant CSDPs can be informed and have ample time to get that. From a timing perspective, there's a strict requirement there. 20 business days are required, unless it's unlisted note and you have contracted out of it. JSE listed notes require 20 business days from that. I think this option is unlikely to be pursued by the market, because it's very on a one-on-one basis. You're actually not fixing the problem here. In other words, going to the core where the issue needs to be amended, which is your program memorandum, not from a pricing perspective. So once you've amended your pricing supplement, you still have to go back and get your program memorandum amended if you want to do a proactive amendment. I'm not talking about waiting until the tough legacy legislation kicks in. I don't think market is going to consider this, but I think it may be an option to consider if you have, and perhaps I need to stand still on that. There are two programs in the market. Some issuers have older programs that still allow for notes outstanding under that program, and more current programs which they're issuing off. So again, you have to go look at your programs that's in the market to see what do you have and which notes are understanding under which program. If it's a previous program, then I think this option may be an option that you may want to follow if you want to do a proactive amendment to the document, so you can fix up those pricing supplement and then just disregard your amendment to, or not even make an amendment to your program memorandum. But yet again, it's very proactive. I don't see anyone going down this, except if there's one or two pricing supplements outstanding. Then if you move on to the next slide there, I think what is important with active transition and also with tough legacy legislation, even with the other option as well, is really looking at the rationale for the proposed changes. What do you want to achieve in terms of these things? And again, I'm going to come back to this a bit later on in terms of amendments. If it's just amending the rate, one can certainly do it by active transition by way of amending the pricing supplements, but one can also look at supplements to the program memorandum if you want to do it from a program from that perspective, get consent for that amendment and introduce that. You know, they have different pros and cons in terms of that. Quite important with these key changes that we are looking at, you need to be very specific to them and ensure that you're only looking at the amendment that's required for JIBAR to ZARONIA, and not making any other changes, because for those other changes you will need further consent from note holders on that point. And then again, as the JSE generally wants, they want a rationale or a reason for that to be introduced in your consent notice that will go out to the market. Now, when I deal with consent notice, I also speak about notices for meetings of note holders, similar notification. It's just packaged in a different way. Then on the next, we go further down. Alison there, thanks very much. The active transition pros and cons, just briefly, depends on which side of the coin you look at these sort of things. Proactive, yes, it works for whatever I just explained to now. It's immediate. It fixes the issue, as I said, spot welding to a specific pricing supplement, but not to the wider schemes of things. It's not at program level. It's not that costly in terms of amending those things, but you're still going through a corporate action process. You still need the consent of note holders or attend the meeting of note holders from that perspective. But again, if you have one pricing supplement, maybe not that eventful and time consuming in terms of that. Larger programs, of course, from that, or larger programs with bigger note, with much larger series or numbers of notes outstanding, this will be definitely a cumbersome process, because you have to go to prepare price consent notice or single consent notice that caters for every single outstanding pricing supplement and the notes that sits under that particular document. So again, talks to what I said earlier on. It is quite a burdensome process in a nutshell from that one. Then option two, if we move on to that is the benchmark replacement language, which we've heard quite a lot about, and I think finally the legislature has, or the Reserve Bank, with the help of the MPG, has come to the party by coming up with some kind of wording or language that is used from that perspective, that can apply to all programs, and you then go and amend in one space, not like in the active transition where we amend the pricing supplements. We would go and amend the program memorandum in its entirety, and then it provides the flexibility for later on switchovers. So if we go to the next one there, thanks, Alison. Again, it's proactive. Like I said, both active transition and benchmark replacements, very proactive. And that's really, and we're going to talk about, why this may be considered as a better option compared to the active transition. But let's just go through this quickly. Benchmark replacement language was issued early on by MPG and SARP around about 30 June 2025. It has been used in some of the more recent updated programs to put it in, to the extent they have been issuing JIBAR rated notes, because what is this benchmark replacement language actually caters for? It allows the program in the T's and C's as a new separate condition. It's about 3 pages long, to give the issuer the right to amend the reference rate to the extent that there's a change, or that reference rate at a later stage then ceases to exist. So in other words, it gives you that flexibility to switch over without the consent. So only consent, this option is only at the program level, where you amend the terms and conditions. So once it's in your program memorandum, you can, as an issuer, just go through the processes of switching over, issue the right notices to the market, and switch over those existing pricing supplements. So it's again a bit of a reverse surgery to your existing pricing supplements. It's not catering for future pricing benchmark replacements. So that you want to do, in other words, direct ZARONIA that you want to issue, I call it direct ZARONIA, but there are ZARONIA rated notes that you want to issue at a later stage. So this is really retrospectively. So it brings your JIBAR rated notes into the fold of ZARONIA rated notes. Again, here, your systems need to be ready when you want to do this. So let's go through that. It's a program level amendment, not an issue level. Again, fortunately you don't need the amendment of each pricing supplement. It's basically getting consent from note holders to introduce the benchmark replacement to mop up the JIBAR rated notes for ZARONIA rated notes at the later stage. So once-off amendment, and this is also applicable in anticipation of the JIBAR cessation date. This wording is definitely not going to help you after the benchmark, after the cessation date, because then it's law, and we're not going to be able to do anything around that. What I have noticed is, and what we've been doing is, and looking at, is also introducing direct wording, or JIBAR direct, I should rather say ZARONIA direct, not JIBAR direct, but ZARONIA direct wording into your program documentation. So in other words, you've got benchmark replacement that looks at the past, and then also put, while you're doing that amendment and going through it, we introduce wording that allows you to issue ZARONIA rated note, or compounded rated notes going forward. So you've catch 2 birds with 1 stone here under this amendment. So I think here again, don't just introduce benchmark replacement, rather also focus on going forward, because once you've done it, you don't have to amend your program later down the line once the cessation JIBAR ceases to exist in December 2026, or from December 2026. This process, again, as the active transition, requires full production, because you do it in advance of the cessation date, and involves the seeking of consent. It's both written consent or meetings of note holders. As I said, always carefully check the thresholds required for vanilla notes and high percentage for restricted matters, or anything else in terms of your terms and conditions. Don't just expect it to be at 66.67%. What this wording allows you to do is, once it's introduced in your program memorandum, you would be in a position to decide, and once your systems are up and running, to decide to switch over from, if you decide to switch over from JIBAR rated notes to ZARONIA rated notes, you can determine, okay, I've got a note for ABCL1 that's coming up. Its interest payment date is at the end of November or the end of October, and I want to switch that note over from JIBAR to ZARONIA, and that particular switch over will then require a SENS announcement. Of course, you wouldn't be able to say to the market, now issue a SENS announcement 5 days, or say a month in advance, or 2 or 3 months in advance of the actual IPD date, or interest payment date, because you want to try to work out the CAS and the career adjustment spread that would be added to the ZARONIA rate to get to the right JIBAR rate as close as possible to the IPD date or the interest payment date. So I think, again, this has not been determined exactly how the process would work, but what I can think and how it would work is that you will try to bring it as close as possible to your IP date, but allow the straight systems to accommodate, and the JSE systems to accommodate that switch over. So you can't do it a day before this IPD date, because straight would not be in a position to accommodate you. They would at least need it 5 days or more longer in order to get the systems aligned for that new date for that new rate to be applicable from and moving from JIBAR to ZARONIA. So in other words, there's two things that need to happen. One would be facing your investors to tell them that there is a rate switch that would happen on an IPD date and what that rate would be in order to get them on side. And then, of course, you need to do it from a practical point of view, from a systems point of view, because Straight would not be able to accommodate that, because from their systems, it will be a JIBAR rated note and will just continue with that note unless you notify them. Now, I know that Sense announcement and Straight notice that we talk about at the bottom of the slide there would go both to Straight and to Sense, but again, there will be some interaction there. There may be some interaction with investors. I don't know exactly how or predict how that thing would work, but given the fact that your terms and conditions allow you to switch over, and if you do follow the right calculations from way of with the assistance, of course, with the dealers or with the ranges on the transaction, with the first 2, 3, I think the market will get the hang of it, and it will purely happen by notifications. I do not think or believe that any issuer will try and come in with a rate that's below the JIBAR rated note, because that would be detrimental to that particular issue to go forward. So I think one will always have to ensure an alignment between what your ZARONIA plus your CAS is to what your JIBAR rate is at that point in time. So again, there will be some magic there in terms of the right steps in order to unpack that going forward. But I think once you've had 1 or 2 going through the market, it will just be a matter of just process of administrative process it will have to follow. Something to note there is it's also to think about, depending on how quick and how many are coming to the market in order to do the switchovers, whether there will be capacity from a Straight point of view to manually adjust their systems, because it's a manual adjustment. They need to capture this new rate into their systems and ensure that that works. So if you've got 10 or 15 issues happening at the same IPD date, I think there's going to be some issues there, and I think it might be advisable that one does reach out to Straight to ensure that your IPD date that you've got planned is not going to be a bottleneck for them, and that they would need enough notice there to accommodate the switchover. Now, from a benchmark replacement option is option 2, which is our benchmark replacement. Just the pros and cons on that very quickly. Proactive market alignment. I know it may be administratively cumbersome because of the corporate action that's required. Yes, there are costs. It's costly, and there are fees involved from both sides, depending on whether you're going to involve the bank. But again, the positive side is once you've done the switch over, and once you've introduced the benchmark replacement language, and you do have the direct wording in your document, you can sit back and cessation can come, or before cessation can come, you can switch your notes over. You don't wait for that bottleneck at the end of the year or next year for these sort of things to happen, and you can basically just glide into the blue yonder in 2026 without lifting a finger, because you'll be able to switch all these things over and have your program ready for direct ZARONIA to be issued at a later stage down the line. So yeah, I think that's on that particular point there. If we move on to the next one, is our third option. Yeah, just before because I've dealt with the proactive steps first, because both active transition and benchmark replacement is a proactive process. There's a consent process involved. I thought it might be just useful just to highlight a couple of things to you in terms of steps. There's definitely a consent notice required, or whether it's in the form of a meeting of note holders or meeting to convene a meeting of note holders, or consent notice that will be prepared. In order, you'll have to have your pricing supplements and program memoranda ready if you are going through the benchmark replacement process. If you are following an active transition process, then of course it's just going to be your pricing supplements that need to be ready and that need to be submitted together with your consent to the JSE. You can't go to the market and pull the trigger and expect your 20 days to run, and after the 20 days you've got your consents that's there. There's going to be some form of engagement with note holders required, whether that would be just speaking to them up front or just by way of sending out your notices, because as I said earlier on, it's going to be quite a bit of an administrative process notifying them and getting those consents and switchovers for the 20 business days to which they need to consent for the rate to be changed or for the program memoranda to be, or the terms to be amended. Now again, that process, you've seen that, and I think a lot of you've been through it in the past, where programs have been amended and restated. It is quite time consuming getting the CSDPs to get their consents through that process, and don't expect that process to be fast-tracked into 2, 3, 5 days, unless the CSDPs are going to be quite overpowered with all the notices that they need to respond to, that they might get it early into the system. But again, in my experience, one always have to wait till the very last day with a lot of help and a lot of push from the banks and issuers to get the CSDPs over the line in terms of getting that sorted. Once the note holders have provided, or investors have provided their consents and attended the meetings of note holders, you would be able to amend those documents, and then those will have to be filed and submitted to the JSE in a similar sort of process. And as I said again, this process has been, you have been through, some of you or most of you have been through this process. So it's a similar process for active transition, benchmark replacement, proactive approach. Right. Option 3 is tough legacy legislation. Now, what is tough legacy legislation? If we, this legislation that and this is something which I think piggybacks on what's happened in the United States, where benchmark replacement and active transition is something which is more, which was frequently applied in the UK. With this approach, tough legacy legislation is being proposed, where it would be incorporated as amendment in the Financial Sector Regulations Act. We understand that draft legislation is being looked at this point in time, and we believe from a good source at this stage that they're aiming to publish the draft legislation by the end of October for public comment. And you may ask us, how long is that consent process going to be? I don't know. It's going to be, could be 4 weeks, 6 weeks in terms of that. But I don't think it's much going to be happening this side of the new year. The concern that we have with this draft legislation is that we need to get this legislation through Parliament. We all know how long Parliament takes to get legislation approved and finalised. But we do understand from engagements with the Reserve Bank that the Reserve Bank has made certain arrangements with the Parliament to actually fast-track this legislation, because we need to get this through by the October, or the plan is to get it through by October, November 2026. This legislation can't be enacted after the cessation date. So I think there's going to be a lot of looking into the crystal ball from the Reserve Bank point of view to ensure that once they announce the cessation date at the end of December for 2025 or 2026, that they will be able to achieve the deadline year to get this legislation out in time. As we said, the deadline is 2026 for the cessation date. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of that happening. Once this act is in place, then it will automatically apply and replace JIBAR with ZARONIA. So the terms, conditions in the program memoranda and pricing supplements would automatically make reference to ZARONIA. And again, if you look at your program memorandum at this stage, your pricing supplement has provision in it where it speaks about the reference rate, and some of the existing pricing supplements, or those that are out there, makes reference to the JIBAR rate there. It's JIBAR rate, South Africa JIBAR rate that's included there. So that will now have to change to ZARONIA. It's automated, so there's not much you can do in terms of it. Whether it's in the document or not, we can't contract out of law. So it needs, as of that cessation date, ZARONIA will take precedent, and it will imply that your JIBAR is no longer existing and that ZARONIA will be in there. Now, I think there would be a question that's coming from you at this stage, but saying, but you can't just switch over. How do I know what that rate is, what my new ZARONIA rate is? So I think there are going to be a bit of legwork involved from issuers to inform or to notify the market of the ZARONIA rate. Now, again, I don't think that's going to happen after the fact, because we've got a procedural system here. And like I said in the beginning on that outset, the bond market's a bit more complicated. Yes, it's easier to navigate in terms of the terms and conditions compared to the loan market, but we've got multiple investors involved, multiple programs out there, documents and pricing supplements that's out there. So we need to have much more engagement in terms of notification processes, getting it through straight, and the JSE. So I think, again, if the end of December 2026 is the date that would be that's earmarked for the cessation date, I think all your rates will, as of the 1st of January 2027, will then be the date of which those news of rates would be kicking off. But in anticipation of that, you will at least, again, in advance of that, give notice to the market. Now, again, we're looking at a December period, and lots of things are shutting down. Lots of people are not around. So I think also put that into your mix and thinking in terms of whether I want to update or wait for Tough Legacy to kick in, or whether I rather want to do the benchmark replacement, because there's a lot of things going to happen in December in terms of getting those notices through. Again, it's not a complicated process. Once you've determined what the CAS is, you would be able to announce via the SENS, and it's basically just a SENS announcement out. So again, it is just something that we need to think about timing there at the end of the year. No corporate actions required here from a program and pricing supplement point of view. There's no amendments there. It's automated, so you don't have to do anything. You can literally just sit back, make sure that your existing pricing supplements are all notified, note holders are all notified as of that particular after cessation date and what the new rate is, and you can sit back and just continue with your pricing supplement, which in my view would not be the best way for any issuer, because your program will be outdated. Yes, legislation will override those provisions, and one can't contract out of law, as I said early on. But my advice would be that one needs to do good order amendments to your program just to ensure that your document is cleaned up. Now, for this particular cleanup, and it's cleaned up for JIBAR, ZARONIA references throughout the documents, and a regulatory update to include the ZARONIA wording and the new ZARONIA rate and your existing pricing supplements. It's all good and well to say I've notified the market by the way of a sense that ABC01, the JIBAR rate is now ZARONIA, and this is what the rate is. But again, tomorrow PDIP sells his note to Jack, and then Jack still sees JIBAR there, and it's going to look quite bad to an issue that it sits there, and I think it will create quite a lot of confusion. So I think it is advisable that one mops up those old JIBAR rates with the new ZARONIA rate that's required there. Now, for these amendments, no consent required. I've done one or two of those in the past, not for ZARONIA, but where we had to make regulatory changes. So that can be done by yourself and with your advisor and the range involved, and that can just be submitted to the JSE without consent. JSE submission is still required, because if you amend your program and it's a listed program, you can't not inform the JSE of your proposed amendments. We're not talking about your information statement that's amended outside of the terms and conditions. But for JSE, they would need to see the amended program memorandum with the new ZARONIA wording in it and the pricing supplements. And again, there, if you can demonstrate that this amendment is of a regulatory nature, then of course it would not require their consent. Any other amendment that you make, remember the rules of the JSE is different from the international market, makes reference to any minor or material change need the consent of note holders. So it's quite important here that you do check your amendments that you're introducing there. So if the amendment is not ZARONIA related, but something else which comes from straight or something else that's from a JSE perspective, then it's still a regulatory, or the amendment still of a regulatory nature. Then in that instance, no consent. But any other amendments, you'll have to get it. And it's only in relation to your T's and C's. I'm not talking about the back end and front end of your program memorandum. So it's quite important to just look at those. And you could get pushback from the JSE in terms of that space. Right, Alice, next one there. Tough legacy legislation. Let's look at the pros and cons of this one. I think this is the one that the market's looking at the most. I thought, as I said, initially, definitely not active transition, but benchmark would take precedent for programs to get tuned into the ZARONIA space. But I think the more we speak to clients at this stage, it seems that rather wait for tough legacy to be enacted And then at that point in time, just do a bit of a cleanup in terms of the program, just bring the necessary things into your program that's required under the new ZARONIA legislation or the ZARONIA language. This process, as I said, is automated. Compliance is effective as of the effective date of the legislation, which is the cessation date. There's no corporate action required. All good and well, so you save a bit of cost there with from a legal and from an arranger perspective. No programs amendments or pricing supplement amendments are required. But again, as I said, good order amendments are advisable. So there will be still engagement with the JSE. But again, no JSE approval required for the amendments of this thing. It is less costly because you're not going through a corporate action process, which is always time consuming, and it is a bit more costly than other processes. But again, it is a quick fix of your program memorandum with just little notification to the market of the new rates that would be required without changing it. And again, you can then, given when it happens at the end of December 2026, that in this early phases of the early Q1 of 2027, you can go through your good order amendments in order to introduce the right things into those things, starting off with your pricing supplements just to get them aligned. But again, it needs to have a backdrop, so I would recommend that you do both program memoranda and pricing supplement at the same time. Then moving over to the next slide. Now, this is a question, if we use a bit of Shakespeare there, update or not to update is the question. I think that's been the question that's been out there for the market for a long, long time. And everyone that we speak to, every engagement that we have from our clients, this is what they want to do. I need to do something now. Or do we need to wait? So I think there are a couple of things which are all in those highlights in those blocks in the middle there of the page where we talk about there are many issues in the market with multiple programs, old and new programs. That are said so that we need to that's actually the starting point of your decision at this stage. So the question really boils down to a proactive versus a reactive approach. Are we going to do the benchmark replacement, get everything right, put the direct ZARONIA in there, sit back and wait for tough legacy to kick in or the cessation date to kick in, and then just do a bit of cleanup changes afterwards? Or are we going to just wait and see for the market to take its course and later do the cleanup change? So it's basically things that would go through your mind. I can't tell you that. I think it's important that one look at each individual, on a case-by-case issue. I think quite important that will confuse the amendments is previous program memoranda that's still alive versus current program memorandum and notes issuance on either one of them. So it's important to look at that, which one you would do and how you would do it. I wouldn't spend much time and money on older programs. Basically, just front end load them with a notice for tough legacy legislation, and then later just fix the pricing supplement on those. Definitely clean up my current program. Question is whether I do it on the outset, be a proactive approach, or whether I wait for my program for the tough legacy to kick in. Again, something that needs to be decided there on that point. Implementation and timing. If you do decide to do the benchmark replacement approach, I wouldn't leave that till the last 2, 3, 4 weeks before tough legacy kicks in at the end of October, November, as we discussed previously. I would definitely start and looking at Q1, Q2, getting that thing through the process. If you have enough time to work through certain IPD dates, so rather we could put it in Q1, get your program updated, go through the consent process. By Q2, you can do all the switchovers depending on your systems, whether those systems are aligned and ready to accommodate ZARONIA. And then you can basically start issuing ZARONIA rated notes if your program is up and running. And again, if you do it on Q1, it also allows you to have your program with direct ZARONIA incorporated to only issue a ZARONIA rated notes as of the end of March. You'll remember from the timeline that I spoke about early on that the legislator or the Reserve Bank request is that only JIBAR ZARONIA rated notes are issued at the end of March going forward. So if you really want to do something on benchmark replacement, get it done, line up as soon as you can, put it through the ringer, in terms of Q1, and then you can just start issuing JIBAR rated notes, ZARONIA rated notes, and fix your JIBAR rated notes all into ZARONIA rated notes. And then that would be by the middle of the year in 2027, you should be ready to with your program with no further ado in terms of sorting stuff out. Then the other so just that's on benchmark replacement. On tough legacy, of course, sit back, enjoy the ride until you get to that back end where tough legacy kicks in. I would still recommend that there must be a bit of proactive approach in anticipation of tough legacy legislation. And why I'm saying that is that get your program ready in advance of that particular date. Not pushing it through the JSE, just sit for legislation, for the legislation to be enacted and effective. Get your program sorted by Q3, Q4, park it. And the moment the JSE, the legislature announces the legislation, the cessation date is in place, you just sign your new program and everything is ready for that new year to kick off and going to the Blue Yonder with your new update. Not start doing it after the cessation date. The reason why I'm saying it is that you may run into timing issues there, quite a lot of bottleneck sort of situations that's going to happen with the JSE in terms of accommodating that, and also with the switch overs from a straight perspective and those sort of things to get it done. Yes, all good and well if the law says everything is effective as of F date, as of X date, but you still need to ensure that straight is notified in time that they can fix their systems to accommodate you with a cessation date happening today, and as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, all those rates need to be switched. It's not going to happen in that time. Give yourself enough time for that. And again, you are a bit in the chicken and egg situation, a bit of a rock and a hard place. Your runway for the change of the rate can't be too far down the line because you need to work it out as close as possible to that cessation date. So when it kicks in, that you can notify the rate to straight so that straight can put it into the systems and get those announcements out in time. I've had engagements with the JSE in terms of fast track in this process, because if we do regulatory changes and those sort of things, yes, that is just a notification that's required because you're just going to notify and submit as a courtesy the amended and restated program memoranda and amended and restated pricing supplements. If you do the benchmark replacement process, JSE advised there is no fast track. You will have to go through the 20 business day process. You can't short circuit that period, and you know that they've aligned it with the Companies Act requirements, section 60 or somewhere in the 60s of the Companies Act, where the 20 business days need to be adhered to. They are not going to issue a directive that short circuit that period, given the volumes. My discussions with them also that depending on how busy they are, and we've seen this a couple of times where the JSE do take their time in terms of looking at your amendments, delays of that 10 business day process. You know, they need 5 days informal comment, 3 days informal approval, and then 2 days for the formal committee, and that's generally between 10 and 15 days to complete that process. Now, again, a benchmark replacement process is a full-on amendment of the program, regardless of just inserting the regulatory stuff. They will still look at your policies. They will still look at your financial statements disclosures. So they're not just going to do a focused review on the amendment. It is as if the program is going for a full-on amendment or restatement, and it just adds on with an added on JIBAR replacement language. So again, that's part of the thinking at this stage, or things that you need to consider for purposes of amending it. I think in a nutshell, the transition mechanisms or options that we spoke about: active transition, spot welding approach, very specific to pricing supplements only, no program memorandum amendments. It may work with older programs. I just want to give a quick summary in terms of where we are. It may work with older programs, older notes under programs, or programs without one pricing supplement out. And if you want to do that, again, it requires a corporate action. We've spoken about the pros and cons. It may alleviate pressure at some stage later down the line. But again, carefully consider old programs or programs that are live, or previous program memorandum that are live vis-a-vis current programs. We spoke about benchmark replacements that's in the market. The wording that's been the NPG that issued that early in June, and that needs to go into the program memorandum. Again, it needs the consent if you do it for the amendment and restatement of the program. It will need corporate action, JSE approval before you can hit the market in terms of that. It has a cost implication there. The nice thing of this is once you've, and I think this is the only benefit actually, is if you follow the proactive approach with benchmark replacement, there's less pressure doing it later down the year with tough legacy. Yes, it has a cost implication given the corporate action that comes with that. Tough legacy, as we said, seems to be the thing that everyone's looking at this stage to save the cost in terms of corporate action that's involved. Again, it's not just a free pass to you to get through without amending your program. You will still have to amend a program memorandum, pricing supplements to align it with those. Not you have to or must, but again, it will be those good order amendments that I spoke about. But again, there is a cost saving there in the end with no engagement of investors and time that will be running in terms of that. Again, also no JSE approval at this point or at that point in time when the cessation date is happening. As long as you stick to the script and only deal with the with ZARONIA language that's going to be inserted. Something to talk about just briefly in terms of these three options. Just from an amendment point of view, I know that people would think, do I need to run to the drawing board, exercise my option now, and then start working on that for now? I don't think so. I think wait till the early part of next year. I also think in terms of the request to issue or the directive to issue only ZARONIA rated notes from March, the question around this, can we do it off your pricing or program memorandum that is owner catering for ZARONIA? And the answer for JIBAR, the answer to that is definitely yes. One certainly have to do a bit of supplementary amendments to your pricing supplement to cater for ZARONIA compounded rate, to insert the dis-supply provisions that relates to provisions that are sitting in your terms and conditions that speak about JIBAR. But it's a quick fix. It's not a massive amendment to those things. So for those of you that wants to issue JIBAR, or rather want to wait and see what the lay of the land is after Q1 and still want to issue it here to the request of the Reserve Bank to issue JIBAR ZARONIA rated notes, there is a way to get around it. It's not complicated. For those of you that wants to issue ZARONIA rated notes as of tomorrow, one can certainly do that. As I said, the prerequisite there is to ensure that your systems are compliant. But again, not massive surgery to your pricing supplements or there's no surgery to the program memorandum, because you just, for that particular issuance, just do a supplementary amendments with additional terms that will be added to the back end of your pricing supplement. And we've looked at that already in terms of this. So I think from our perspective, what we've seen at this stage is we've seen one or two issuers coming to market with benchmark replacement that they want to put in. Well, let me go one step back. We have not seen active transition. Nothing of that is happening at this stage. We have seen issuers looking at benchmark, don't want to go through the rush at the end of the years when those things are kicking, rather have everything sorted, put benchmark in. We've catered for direct ZARONIA in there so that you don't need to update your program after the cessation date. The benchmark replacement will no longer be used. If you pass the cessation date, you will just use the direct ZARONIA. So we've looked at that. We've also looked at issuers with pricing supplements for direct ZARONIA to put that in. To issue it now, if they want to issue their pricing supplements, so looking at that at this particular point in time. In terms of tough legacy, we haven't seen any of that because the legislation is still coming through, and it will be hopefully being passed at the right time so that one can introduce that and then just amend the programs after that. So I think seen a couple of these. I think the market will still develop in terms of process and what's happening and when it's going to happen. My prediction is that we can see quite a bit of activity around the early parts of Q1, Q2 next year in terms of benchmark replacement. And as we have heard so many times from a lot of clients, they don't want to be the first thereafter flag Pearl to run ahead and plant it and say, I've changed my program. So I also advise clients, let's see, because we see quite a lot of development in this space. Something that did come through with this whole process, which we've seen to date, was the direct ZARONIA language that's been introduced into the benchmark, coupled with the benchmark replacement language into the program. And if everyone was just running to plant their flag and just put benchmark in, they might have missed the boat. So I think hold back a bit, look at Q1, Q2, what you want to do. And if you want to do benchmark, let's do it then. Or one can consider doing it then, or one can wait for tough legacy to kick in at a later stage.